You're listening to the Now More Than Ever podcast, an exclusive presentation of Send the Food Back Media. The views and opinions expressed belong solely to the podcast hosts and do not represent the views of any normal people.
Thank you so much, Mr. Clark, for saying what needed to be said. I don't want to see it.
We sleep all day, and we run the streets at night. We're looking for some girls, so we can party all night. They call us juvenile delinquents. They say we're out of control. Juvenile delinquents, 'cause we like to rock and we like to roll.
Thank you.
Man.
It's time to fucking go.
Idiot.
Nixon now. Nixon now.
All right, this show features a good friend of mine, longtime collaborator, and truly one of the smartest people that I have had the pleasure of interacting with or kind of coming up with in the business, and that is Zach McCrary. I joke with Zach that he is one of the only people whose edits I will accept almost without question. Just like if he says this makes a sentence better, or he says this makes your message clearer, I'm really not apt to argue. That wasn't always the case, but what I have learned over the years is that Zach doesn't necessarily talk the loudest or the most, but he gets a lot of mileage out of what he says. And this conversation is cool because we really do get to chart his rise from basically being, a politics nerd to being at what I would call the pinnacle of the industry. He has helped elect 2 presidents and numerous senators and numerous governors, and he also lives outside the Beltway, and so seems to know a little bit more about how real people talk, and we get into a lot of that in terms of voter behavior and how voters accept messages and things like that. And it's just it's a pretty good conversation and a pretty good distillation of the stuff Zach has been able to do in his career, and some stuff that I was able to work on him with. And he's a great conversationalist. And also we talk about the important things like pro wrestling, the band, and Mr. Belvedere. I'm excited to have Zach on because actually he has kind of been a sounding board for me on a lot of things. And whether he knows it or not, I've used him as that. And I actually, the first time that I had a reveal of that we could do this and that we should do it, and then we did, it was came out of a road trip that Zach and I took to an AAPC thing. And we were like listening to a podcast or something, and I was just kind of talking about how small the world was and stuff like that, but I didn't really have the focus down. And then about, I don't know, we started this in the early pandemic, and then a little bit after the election, Zach did something that was very strange in 2021, and he called me, and I was so freaked out by it that I immediately answered the phone and was like, "Hey, what's going on?" And he was like, "Oh, no big deal if you're busy, but
I'm not in prison. I haven't been kidnapped.
I just want to discuss maybe starting a podcast." And so, and it was funny because the one of the first, actually the first and second conversations that we had about it, Zach mentioned a couple guests, and part of, of course, part of my brain was like, those are people I want to come on my podcast. But, then, we kind of talked it through, and he has since started, Political Pro podcast. Is that what it's called?
Pro Politics podcast. Yeah. At our discussion at the moment, I've a couple podcasts in. I've actually over prepared and have 15 or 16 already recorded. I'm trying to figure out if it's okay if I say things like in the can. I don't know if that's, I don't know. I don't want to be one of those people, but I have 15 or 16 already done. But yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with it. But Dave, you and Chris were both very generous with your time as I was thinking through this, both in terms of the concept and just as much as anything, the nuts and bolts of it. And I've been surprised. And again, you guys have a much more sophisticated operation, but my thought here is that what I'm doing is not trying to compete with This American Life and not trying to be the most sophisticated, slick, polished production, but just talk to interesting people about things that are at least interesting to me and hopefully will be interesting to under a admittedly niche audience. But that's what I'm going for. And both you and Chris were very generous with your time as I was thinking it through in the early phases. And I found it's been, more DIY friendly than I was afraid it would, not to encourage more people to come compete with us. But it's been more DIY friendly than I was afraid it might be initially.
It's interesting because I'm being facetious in that, like, I don't think that in any way we even compete for guests, because it's funny because as much as you and I have sort of charted our rise in the business together, as stupid as that might sound, we just kind of came up together from the very beginning. And so we have access to different guests, but we also come at things from a different angle. And so one of the things that struck me of listening to your shows, I've listened to both the Bagawa one and the one with the woman from the Gephardt campaign,
Rebecca Piercy.
She's like kind of unbelievably smart.
Who most recently was a political director for Elizabeth Warren's.
And I think one of the things that, not to wash your balls or anything on a Sunday morning, but I like the interview style is interesting because we're kind of like broad-based, hey, just talk about that. And you kind of ask a little bit more specific questions or stuff. But it's just an interesting, sort of differential in styles. And what we want out of it. And so I think that I think that the rising tide lifts all boats,
I am very jealous and covet some of the guests you've had. So I will disagree with you there. I do find I have been been grinding my teeth about some of that, but no, you're very, very generous. And I do think people sort of either get people actually listen to podcasts and sort of dig this kind of stuff. And, mine may be a little bit more than yours, but is a very niche audience, trying to reach people who were specifically in politics or sort of like super duper in the weeds in politics, versus I think you and Chris have a little more broad based appeal. But yeah, I mean, I was a political junkie from an early age. Grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. College graduates, upper middle class family, but a family that was not politically engaged in a serious way beyond watching the news and things like that. But somehow I remember in fifth grade, I was in fifth grade during the 1992 Democratic primaries, talking about that with my teacher and sort of handicapping, is Jerry Brown going to win the Connecticut primary or Paul Tsongas, this and that, and things that were bizarre. And pretty soon after that, I ran across, this would have been in junior high, an Almanac of American Politics in my school library. It's a reference book. It still exists. They put it out every 2 years, but it's meant to be a reference book. And I found it in my, I think, 8th grade library. They let me check it out. You're not supposed to be able to check out reference books. They let me check it out. And I, read this reference book, in 8th grade, like it was a narrative, like a psycho. Yeah. And really, that was a formative moment for me. And then a couple years later, I found at a bookstore, I think it was the 1978 Almanac of American Politics, and it really, it didn't occur to me to go find sort of the back issues and all of that. And so I, now I have I found all of them, and through high school and college, just was ravenous about that, and been very fortunate that I've been able to make a good living and find a professional path to where that is benefiting, where that benefited me, and I've. The idea of working and thinking and writing about politics professionally is all I ever wanted.
You had a thing the other day, I think, on Twitter about maybe having extra ones of a couple issues, mm-hmm. And before I could even reply, and usually I'm like the first reply guy to a lot of your stuff. So all those election Twitter nerds had grabbed them.
Yeah, it's so easy, and it's a good thing. It's so easy these days. I mean, I came. I started getting interested in politics right before the internet kicked off, and benefited certainly from things that were available on the internet as I was cutting my teeth. But now it's just a much different animal, and there are a lot of these kids that are in school, high school and college, who are extremely sophisticated, and you can access this information. You don't have to go find a reference book, a dusty reference book in a library. All this stuff is available at your fingertips. So it's, I think, a little easier to be an election political nerd these days, but it's there's so much good information out there these days. When it wasn't that long ago where to get the kind of access. And I on my podcast, I talked to Charlie Cook, who's an elections handicapper, and he talks about in the days before the internet became so ubiquitous, and this would have been the early mid 2000s, really the only way to get a lot of this information that we now take for granted, who's running for this and all the political information. You had to subscribe to things like the National Journal and these massive clip services who were charging thousands of dollars a year. This was not a newspaper subscription for a few bucks. This was meant to be serving the Chamber of Commerce and meant to be paid for by labor unions and big entities. There's really been a leveling of the field in terms of political information. So it's a lot easier, thankfully, to be a political nerd. That information is more accessible these days than it was when I was really starting to nerd out in junior high.
I was going to say that your story about finding those old reference books and taking them home and stuff, you're definitely in the right place, because I think Dave and I were both like, that sounds totally normal to me for something like a junior high student to do. I also follow you on Twitter, and one thing I'm very impressed with is your collection of campaign ephemera. It is impressive and like spans the whole. I don't know. What's the oldest like campaign button? You got like Truman, something like that?
Yeah, I think maybe Woodrow Wilson. So that would be like 1912 or something like that. Yeah. I've just always been, again, it just goes back to being a political nerd. And I don't even remember the first few things I tracked down. Some of them I come by honestly working on campaigns and going into campaign offices that I've worked in and pocketing the stuff that are just laying around that is not tied down and helping myself to it. And other things, there are other collectors out there, and I have no idea. I don't think anything I have is especially valuable. There are some people who collect, and they only want political buttons or political materials with people's faces on them, or want coattail things where it says, vote for president and vice president and senate and things like that. I just sort of like, any of these politicians that I'm interested in, presidential, the ones that I'm actually most interested in are down ballots, senators and governors. One of my, I know both you and Dave are, Lyndon Johnson nerds like myself. One of my current favorite ones is a guy that was a Lyndon Johnson protege, served in the House. I don't know if he took Lyndon Johnson's seat, but was absolutely Lyndon Johnson protege, served in the House from Texas, was Jake Pickle, who was around for years and years and years in the House until probably from the 60s until the 90s.
Right.
Yeah.
Put that on the list, Dave, of our great political names.
Jake Pickle, and he actually has it looks like a pickle. It is a pickle with the name Jake on it. And I found one I didn't know, and so you talk to people around Texas politics, and that's everybody is familiar with that, and people still talk about it in political circles. And then I found one recently. Just through a friend of mine had it, John Hines, who was a senator from Pennsylvania, the Hines family, catch up and whatever else. And I guess they do pickles as well. So I found one recently. John Hines had a pickle pen. I've always nerded out on that. I'm a Democrat. I'm progressive, but as much as anything, my path to this business, to working in this business has been, come by it honestly as a real political nerd, a real political junkie. And again, I've been very fortunate that I've been able to find a place in this profession, that has allowed me to use some of what it's allowed me to dig that has allowed me to really sink my teeth into that passion that I developed at an early age.
One thing that strikes me these days, especially as I get older, is like the pathology a little bit of candidates. And like Jake Pickle, it's funny because we say, what a great name. And of course he had a fucking pickle, but do you know the agita that he probably had over using that? Because I bet you in Texas in like the 1940s and 50s, he was constantly johned on for having a dumb name like Jake Pickle. And then for him to use the pickle. I mean, when I talk about this all the time, but in 2011, when Todd let us use Keep Montgomery Strange, and then in 2015, when he really let us like make that the focal point of our online communication, that was like a large psychological step in that man's brain. Like, because his entire life, you know, his name is Todd R. Strange. And he told me that his biggest nightmare in 2009 would be if we won and the advertiser's headline was Montgomery elects Strange mayor.
Yeah, I mean, I remember.
So it's just funny, like, it's just a weird ephemera, right, or whatever, that, like, in 2005, I would have told everyone to fuck off about that, right? And now I'm like, man, I bet you that was, like, a big deal for old Jake Pickle to use that pickle.
Yeah, you know, that's one of the things that I remember, you know, I haven't thought about in years, but, you know, when I was just becoming aware and I, you know, used to be a party trick I have, and I think I could still do it, maybe not quite as quickly as I used to, about naming all 100 senators and governors. But as a kid, a junior high and high school, becoming, you know, learning about these senators and their backgrounds. And I just remember thinking at the time how a lot of these people, mostly men, had these sort of strange names. It was, you know, Thad Cochran, Trent Lott, Slade Gorton, the senator from Washington, Harris Wofford, Weiss Fowler,
right?
These names. I didn't know anybody that had these names. I didn't know, none of my friends' dads had these names. And so I don't really have a working theory to that. Evan Bye, I mean, just sort of these unusual, I don't know if they're like soap opera names or what. Birch Bye, a great name. Lloyd Benson, you know, sort of these, you know, yeah, I mean, it feels like these names that you could take out of Robert Penn Warren or something like that. And it felt like there was something to it at the time. I think maybe some of that has, you know, even in Alabama, you know, Hinton Mitchum was a state senator, Wendell Mitchell, Lowell Barron. I mean, I didn't know anybody I still don't know anybody that has these names. And so I don't know if there's anything to it, but as a kid, I remember thinking, is there some correlation here? These guys that have these, you know, soap opera names or whatever you would call them that have risen through the ranks to be very, very successful. So, you know, there might be something in these names. What
was the first political job you had, either just volunteering on a campaign or a paid political job?
The first thing of any note was I grew up in Mississippi. We moved to Montgomery, Alabama area when I was in high school. My father changed jobs and volunteered, initially worked very low level, you know, just sort of $20 here and there at most for Don Siegelman when he ran for governor in 1998. He was then lieutenant governor. Ran against Fob James, worked out of the Montgomery. They had a Montgomery headquarters over where the current Montgomery Mall is, and, you know, would drive around and, you know, put up signs and put signs together. They had these horrible they had some of the traditional signs, you know, where you stick in the wire racks, and they had, for some reason, they must have been cheaper, bought these signs you had to hammer together with a hammer and a wooden stake.
Somebody got him a good deal on that.
And they were terrible. I mean, I would spend hours putting these together. They were terrible. And then, you know, I'd go back the next week and everybody was coming back complaining about those signs because they were not very good and everybody wanted the more traditional plastic signs. But that was the first, you know, campaign. That would have been 97. 97, 98. I was 16, a junior in high school. I had you know, paged at the Mississippi State Senate, which was a fun experience in that era. That was an era where Democrats were still in control of the Mississippi State Senate, and some of these sort of old throwback personalities, these guys who had, you know, a lot of them who had come up in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and were a throwback to a different
Chris
type of Democrat.
Have decided that all those men are that's like the seething era of Democrats. And so, like, we have this there's a weird etymology to it because, shocker, there's a weird etymology to some joke that we only get. But that, you know, that like like every one of those guys was like a bourbon drinking, cig smoking, like seething individual, you know, just like, let me tell you about this shit, you know.
They're Joe Franks,
right? Joe Frank Harris is the patron saint of seething for us, for no reason except that we've decided that he is.
And listen, I'm a Democrat, and, you know, I'm sure a lot of it is wrapped up in partisanships, but you sort of look back in that era, and I think you could do this in most states. I think you could do this at the federal level. And again, part of my bitterness is because Democrats have been replaced by Republicans, but sort of these old, interesting personalities, you know, I think have been replaced by, you know, people who are just more boring and more sanitized, who, you know, politics has changed. The campaigning has changed. The actual governance has changed. And I do think, here, in Alabama, not to, to get too many deep cuts, but there are a lot of these sort of quirky old school guys who are a little unpredictable, a little dirt under their fingernails. A lot of these who were, Democrats, some of them conservative Democrats, some of them who wanted you to think they were conservative Democrats, but really were not, really were pretty progressive, and mostly been replaced by sort of cookie cutter Republicans who, again, as a Democrat, I don't really even distinguish between a lot of them. And I think that, somebody who, again, I'm a partisan, I have, certainly a progressive ideology, but somebody who just roots for interesting and likes characters in politics, it's sort of a bummer to see that has been sort of weeded out of the political system over the last generation. Yeah,
don't you think that a lot of there was like almost like a specific local pathology to almost every one of these guys? Like, let me tell you about Russellville, or let me tell you about Fife and why we do things that way. Yeah. And their votes sometimes hinged on like something that happened in Fife in 1940 or whatever. And like, so I could never go against the steel workers or what, Yeah. And it's just, and you just don't have that anymore, really on any level.
And Dave, you and I saw this on some of the folks we worked with at the legislative level in Alabama. Some of these types, these moderate to conservative Democrats who hung on in very tough terrain. But yeah, you would see this happening. And as a pollster, we're looking for messaging that is the most effective and the broadest base. And sometimes it would be a reality check to a lot of these old school incumbents who, had spent, entire terms trying to get some roads paved or trying to get some new interstate exchange. And at least in the polling, and again, polling is not meant to be Moses coming down from the mountain necessarily, but at least in the polling, we'd see, well, people actually care that you voted against a legislative pay raise more. People actually care that you want to raise teacher pay more than you created a new access road off of Highway 13 or whatever. And that was just hard for people's heads to get around. I remember being in, to do a little name dropping, being around the governor of Louisiana in 2019 when he was winning re-election, and in his boiler room on that election night, and you had some really old school folks there. I mean, John Breaux, who was a senator from Louisiana for years and years, and people like old school legislators and things like that. And our guy was winning, but you saw all these guys who cut their teeth on politics in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the map had just totally flipped, and you could sort of see them, like sort of a dog watching a television, didn't quite know what was going on because the areas that they think of as Democratic in Louisiana, it's these Cajun bayou parishes, were strong for Republicans. And you saw these suburban areas outside of New Orleans, that had been the first places to go Republican. In Jefferson Parish in Louisiana, for example, long been one of the most conservative parishes, a suburban area, went very strongly for the Democratic governor. And so, it has been, we certainly have seen that in Trump accelerated it, demographic changes accelerated it, Obama probably accelerated it. But over the last 10, 15 years, I do think you've seen social media changed it. You've seen a lot of this movement. And again, as somebody who has a nostalgic, a bit of a nostalgic bent, and before we maybe even went live, I talked about where I don't really know anything about music. After like 2001, I find myself just watching Law and Order reruns and Seinfeld reruns and things like that. As opposed to going
regular
and finding
Law
any
and Order too, not even SVU or anything.
Oh, right. The Jerry Orbach, Jerry Orbach
missionary position Law and Order.
Yes.
Yeah. I do think it's sort of lost something, but again, I think it's the political system has lost something. But again, I absolutely suspect that's much more of a nostalgia for old days, and actually anything that's better or worse.
Do you? So okay, that you're probably right and it's interesting that you recognize that, because most people just take that sort of what they came up as the gospel, and it's hard. That's like the story of America. It's hard for people to change, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about polling is, especially these long-term incumbents, is polling is a reality check to a lot of these folks. And again, we're not our firm, and I don't believe that polling is incontrovertible. You need to build in. You need to build in, some other context here, and there's all sorts of things that need to go in the mix. But if you're going to, conduct you're going to take the budget out of a campaign to conduct a real survey, and polling is getting increasingly difficult and increasingly expensive to do. So if you're going to do it, generally you need to do it with the understanding that it's going to inform how the campaign is going to operate, how a campaign is going to spend its money. But you see this a lot of times where polling is candidates and some of these longtime incumbents are just mugged by reality when they see the polling and realize, well, most people in your district don't know you exist. Or most people in your district don't know that, anything you've done, or don't have a strong opinion on this legislation that you've spent the last decade of your life committed to. And I think that sort of has helped me. It was a good balance for me from somebody who got hip to politics by reading these narratives and reading the Almanac of American Politics and some of this romanticization, some of the making of the president and the Theodore White type stuff. When I think, not that stuff necessarily runs against polling, but, some of the glamour, some of the romanticism is weeded out when you're looking into the data, and that is informing what you're doing, as opposed to, what a candidate or a kitchen cabinet around a candidate actually believes is the most important thing.
Do you think that voters are, and this is almost a very specific question as it relates to Georgia, do you think that Georgia, again, very specific question. So do you think that Georgia Republicans honestly just don't see how the map in these statewide elections that we just saw, where Biden and then the two Senate races flipped? Do you think that they don't see that yet? The average voter, I think that I think candidates definitely see it. They know demographics. They know, they study that. But the average, Republican living in Fayetteville or Noonan, do you think that do they understand why things are changing in Georgia, or are they just like, this is bunk?
I think there's probably some delay to that for a lot of folks. I mean, we see, unfortunately, and I think this 100% is because of Trump and some of the people around Trump who've enabled him, and some people in Georgia have. Brian Kemp has been caught in the crosshairs on this, but I mean, we see that 2/3 or so of Republicans, in Georgia is a place where I've seen data specifically, but this I think is pretty broad nationally. 2/3 of Republicans in Georgia think that the election was stolen from Trump. Think that Trump legitimately got more votes, more fair votes, more honest votes than did Biden. So I think there is a head in the sand quality. I think Trump has given people the sort of permission to keep their head in the sand a little longer by in Georgia specifically by claiming that this was stolen from them. I do think it is an interesting question as to what some of the elites in the party believe. You certainly saw Brian Kemp, who is governor because he was able to mobilize some of what Trump, the Trump style voter, the Trump style messaging, but also appointed a senator in Kelly Loeffler, who the idea at the time was Loeffler was this, suburban Buckhead style, white woman who would appeal to this coalition, to a lot of these voters who were moving Democratic. It didn't work that way at the end of the day for Loeffler, but that was sort of the idea.
So I think because of her own actions. It didn't work because she never made any attempt to move in that direction.
I think she and the people around her probably would say she got pulled right.
She got caught in that undertow, right, of the Doug Collins primary, and having to run commercials that said she was literally to the right of Attila the Hun.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so, it's absolutely in a vice. These Republicans are in a vice in a way that you see Democrats have been in a vice in some of the states that have been moving Republican in the Rust Belt and in rural and small town America across the country. But I mean, I do think Georgia is, in my mind, I think the only question for Georgia is, not is Georgia a swing state? Because I think it is a swing state here to say, but is it more like a North Carolina style swing state where it's going to sort of hang at that 50-50 level, and sometimes Democrats win, sometimes Republican wins? I think that's probably most likely, but I think there's also another model where you look at Virginia, where Virginia was at the start of the 2008 campaign when Barack Obama won. A Democrat had not carried Virginia for president since 1964. Even Jimmy Carter did not carry Virginia in his campaigns. A Democrat had not won Virginia since 1964 until Barack Obama broke through in 2008. It had a cycle or two as a real legitimate swing state, and now Democrats have pretty much won every race that has mattered for the last decade. Again, I wouldn't predict quite that level of speed for Georgia moving, but I do think it should be a warning sign for Republicans that they might not have quite as long as they think they do to get their act together in Georgia.
I think I saw something that said that it was also Virginia 2020 was the first double-digit win for the Democrat for president since FDR's final reelection. So maybe since 44.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was 40.
And Virginia Republicans kept rolling out these, pretty much, right-wing. I mean, some candidates better than others, but, some of these very right-wing candidates of the Virginia of the 80s and 90s, not the Virginia of the 10s, of the 2010s and 2020s. And I think that at a minimum, Georgia Republicans have much less room for error than they thought they did. And, I think it could be, we'll see. I mean, one of the big questions is, if Trump indeed does stay off of the stage, and who knows, you probably should bet that Trump is going to, the smart money is that Trump is going to continue to consume a ton of political oxygen. But I think the question is, do these suburban areas continue to accelerate and continue to move Democratic at a rate that we've seen over the last 6 or 8 years in the Trump era? Or if Trump, disappears, if Trump chills out, do those areas, suburban areas, move a little bit back to how they were before Trump? Are they more competitive? Does at least the rate of movement toward Democrats slow? And I think that's an unanswerable question at this moment. But Georgia is really ripe, not just in my mind, not just to be a very much a swing state, but I think is especially now that the Democrats have broken through. I think Georgia is now going to be viewed from the Democratic side as, not a luxury item, but as an imperative item in terms of a electoral college map, in terms of having these senators in Georgia. As Democrats, it gets tougher for Democrats to win in the Iowas and some of the places in the Midwest. Then I think Georgia, in some previous cycles, it felt like a little bit of a luxury item, take a flyer on it. But I think it's going to be treated by Democrats as much more of an imperative. And I think that's only going to make Democrats, only going to make Democrats much more embedded in trying to maintain this growth that we've seen over the last several years.
Yeah, I have this thing about, I always talk about how generals always fight the last war. And it seems to me like in Virginia, where they kind of overlearned the lesson of 2010, where they were able to break through and win, I think, most of the row offices, they being the Republicans. And then they just kind of felt like, okay, that was because we went hard to the right and not just because of the year and that literally anybody was going to run. And some of these states, they really suffer from when they have a primary on one side, that person really emerges, damaged or whatever, and it's hard for them to swing back to the center. So, let's back up to Chris asked you about what your first political stuff was, but then, so Siegelman, then you go to high school, and then go to college. You went to Alabama, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Then how'd you get into how'd you get into the industry?
Through some of that political work I did for Siegelman in 97, 98, these are some folks that, Dave, you certainly know, Giles Perkins, Wade Perry, among others who were in that Siegelman,
milieu,
universe, oeuvre, in the 98
leitmotif
campaign. I did a pretty good job. In retrospect, I probably should have done a better job. Did a pretty good job of sort of staying in touch with some of those folks when I was in college, and then in my one summer I was able to go. I had a real job working at the Democratic Party in the 2000 elections and did some field work and was just a utility player. Again, didn't really know much of anything, but was able to have a job, was able to sort of learn the ropes, actually not just with my nose in a book, but actually see how politics really worked. And this is the 2000 era. There wasn't a ton going on in the state that cycle. But Democrats still, had the Democratic governor, you had a Democratic legislature. So there's a real operation around them. So I stayed in touch, with those folks, and that gave me, beyond just being a volunteer in the 98 campaign, actually gave me a little bit of credentials, made my bones. I don't want to overstate it, but actually developed a relationship with some folks who, continued for years and years to stay very involved there. But after college, my wife and I moved to Atlanta for a while. My wife is an engineer. Went there because she had a good job as an engineer there, and started I guess in some ways I haven't really thought about it, but it's maybe not too dissimilar to how I've approached the podcast I've started. But in the 2005, I was doing some, mostly freelancing, almost literally freelancing, doing some journalism for campaigns and elections and some other entities. But I started a website, a blog, I guess you called it then, in 2005, talking about Alabama politics. I lived in Georgia, but was just sort of interested in what was going on. And my goal was just to have a place where people would, who knew more than I did, would hopefully find that site, and I would learn sort of what was going on from there. I started that, and it was really just a matter of months, but again, very small readership, but a niche audience, and the people who read it were plugged into politics. And then in that era, because of that, I developed a rapport with Jeff Martin, who is been a long time Montgomery insider, Democratic, worked in the Folsom administration, and has been around as a lobbyist now, among other things. Joe Turnham, who was the Democratic Party chair. So I had because of this website I started, and again, this was just a few months, the timing was right. The Alabama Democratic Party had money from the national entity to hire a communications director. And it just happened that I was sort of right place, right time. I had this website and a little bit of a profile, again, not to overstate it, but they sort of knew I was out there and saw my stuff and thought it was.
You could string a couple words together, right?
Yeah. It held its own. And I'd also had this other earlier tenure of saying, well, I actually did work for the Alabama Democratic Party before. So I wasn't, complete non-entity, and had people who could vouch for me on that. And so, took a flyer on that, and, certainly grateful that my wife, who found a really good job as an engineer in Atlanta at that time, was willing to move back here to Montgomery, Alabama, and where she's since started her own firm here. So she's been a star everywhere she's been. But that got me into the door in a real way, in a professional way, as communications director for the Alabama Democratic Party, and that was the 2006 cycle, really the last gasp of competitive two-party state. In a lot of ways, Bob Riley was winning re-election. Republicans certainly won plenty of races, but Democrats won really tough races for Lieutenant Governor Jim Folsom, Chief Justice Sue Bell Cobb, other down ballot races. And Democrats, in many ways, most importantly, held the legislature in 2006, despite a very aggressive campaign.
I think even gained a seat or two in the House, right? Which is kind of wild to think about.
Yeah, and Alabama certainly, pretty soon after that, 2010 and since, has been very much a one-party Republican state in almost all ways. But Alabama actually hung on longer than a lot of these other states. I mean, you guys know Georgia pretty much flipped after the 2002 elections. Yep. Mississippi was earlier. Florida was in like the late 90s, early 2000s. Tennessee flipped. Virginia flipped, a decade earlier. So Alabama, certainly not progressive bastion, but the Democrats actually held on longer in Alabama, especially looking at the legislature, than they did almost anywhere else in the South. And I do think that probably has something to do with the infrastructure there. And Paul Hubbard was who was the head of the Alabama Teachers Union, who a lot of people will tell you was the most important person in the state, and at times was more powerful whoever happened to be governor at the time was for decades. And, at some point the wheels came off and demographics caught up with everything. And there were some unforced errors as well, in terms of Democrats. After 2006, Democrats exceed expectations, hold on to the legislature, after a very aggressive, well-funded push by Republicans. Democrats hold the legislature in 2006. In 2007, Democrats start the first action they do, almost literally, is to go raise their pay by 58% or something. And so that was, I don't know that was determinative necessarily, but that was, that got things off to it didn't help. I think it definitely got some people beat, maybe not enough to have held the majority. But, 4 years later in 2010, Republicans win everything there is to win. And, you knew, even heading into that, you knew that that was only going to go in one direction, that whenever Republicans broke through, it wasn't going to come back anytime soon. Right. And that's certainly been borne out in the decade since.
Now more than ever.
I saw this question just kind of came from a comment that I actually saw on your Twitter one day. And it was complimenting you as a host on your podcast based on the number of focus groups that you do in your professional life. What is something about, and I'm going to ask this about Democratic voters because that's who that's the party that you work with. What's something that people may not know about Democratic voters that you've learned in, let's say the 2018 and 2020 cycles? We know anybody that knows anything knows that voters for a party are not monolithic in their beliefs. Like there's a couple of issues that you trail off to the other side, or you trail off in some fourth or fifth direction. So what's something about Democratic voters that you've learned in these focus groups that people may not know that might surprise us?
Yeah, focus groups are a blast to do. Again, it's polling is a reality check in a lot of ways, but it's sort of bloodless. It's all spreadsheets and numbers. But focus groups, qualitative research is, and I have moderated, between 150, 200 focus groups at this point. Where you're actually in the room and you're seeing voters, you're seeing whether they're Democratic voters, whether they're swing voters, you're sitting across the table from them and seeing their body language and really interacting in a way that is incredibly unique. And I find them very, very helpful for campaigns. And frankly, I think that's one reason where my pollsters, in addition to being in the data, are often a little better suited to be the gut check and to reel back in campaigns when campaigns get a little off message, because pollsters are the ones in the data and in the room with these voters. But I do think that one of the things you see, Chris, is that voters, whether they're Democratic voters, Republican voters, or supposedly swing voters, is have no interest in like ideological consistency. People who are who think about politics a lot, people who are in politics, people who consume news. Most people have very well-defined ideologies, and they prize intellectual consistency, and they put a lot of thought into these things. In a lot of cases, you can have voters who think they're Democratic voters and who ID as Democratic voters when you're screening them to get them in the room, and then they say something which is exactly what you would think would come out of a Republican's mouth on immigration or cultural issues, or they're intrigued by a flat tax or something that would seem to be anathema to most professional Democrats. So I do think that is one of the things you learn pretty quickly in focus groups, is that and I that's not even a criticism. I think it's how most people are. I don't think it means that it doesn't mean the voter's unintelligent by any means. I think they just consume politics in a much different way than those of us who are obsessed with it and who think about it a lot. So I do think that's a very good lesson to learn. Also, just how little news penetrates the average voter. maybe they see what Trump has said, in the last, maybe they see what's happened at the presidential level. Maybe they haven't. But believe me, they're seeing almost nothing about what's happening in Congress. They're seeing almost nothing that is happening at the state legislative level. Mayors can be a little different. People have a relationship with their mayors that is a bit more tangible. But I remember being in focus groups with swing voters in Orange County, California, just a matter of months after the Republican healthcare bill went down, and that consumed Washington. It was the dominant issue in 2017 and 2018. We had focus groups with swing voters, and these are Orange County, which is high income. These were relatively high education voters. These are people who, we could tell, but from their voting history, had participated in elections, and they could barely remember anything that had been said about the healthcare debate, a couple of months after. And I think that's just a good reality check that most voters, especially a lot of swing voters, actively try to avoid thinking about politics. They got to pick their kids up at soccer practice and got to figure out which grocery store they're going to go to, and have a lot of other things they're thinking about. And politics often is something they want to think about less rather than more. So I think that's a good reality check. The one other thing you can always count on in focus groups, and the way that I like to do them, different pollsters, different moderators do them differently, is I like to have usually fewer rather than more people in the room. I think that leads to a better conversation. So I usually do 7 or 8 people at any one time. I know there are people who are good at what they do who do 10 or 12 or even more. But even with 7 or 8 people in the room, you can always count on the one pothead in the room, the one person whose every answer is, what should we do about schools? What should we do about this? What's the most important issue is making some sort of argument for legalizing weed. So that's 1 out of 8, which is probably about right. You can always count on that one person, and a lot of times we'll try to put odds on who the first person in the room is going to be to bring up legalizing weed,
and have their car searched after the event.
Yeah, it's almost like what you're talking about with swing voters or whatever. It's almost like on a lot of elections, voters vote on vibe more than they vote on like what your specific position on, on whatever issue it is. It's just more of like, we talk about like the totality of the evidence, the overall amount and style of communication really does, even in extremely partisan areas, it seems like it can at least get you to, where people are moving off of the, like maybe moving off of the party in power or whatever. And they might move to neutral, and then a lot of times they swing back to, they come home, right? Which we saw in like Iowa or South Carolina or whatever this cycle.
Seems like the challenge, Dave, would be for the guys that, the messaging guys and the ad makers, when presented with what Zach just said. I mean, it's easy to write ads for when all you have to do is say very conservative, such and such Joe Blow, or, Nancy such and such is very progressive. But when you're faced with a race that's more competitive, and you hear what Zach just said, he's hearing in focus groups, all these mixed messages, and then you have to write an ad for that. Like, wow. I mean, that's, to me, that seems like where you earn your money right there.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, one of the most valuable things I think in focus groups, and this is a little bit of a luxury item. I mean, for example, a Senate race, a governor's race, certainly presidential race, will conduct focus groups. But even a hot Senate race might do 2 or 3 rounds of focus groups, might get 2 or 3 bites at the apple. This is not something where you have, weekly focus groups to benefit from. A really hot congressional race,
like constant ad testing or something.
I mean, for the most part, it's rare that you have most races don't have the ability to do a lot of in-depth focus groups. Even hot congressional races that are spending $4 million might have 1 round of focus groups. Maybe, wow. And maybe not. I've certainly been on both sides of that. But one of the things that I find very helpful in the media consultants don't always like this, but is showing ads to focus group participants, or even specific ads can be helpful. See what jumps out at people, or even just footage of your candidate speaking to camera, of the other candidate speaking to camera. There's sort of this assumption, we're all around these candidates. Hopefully most of the times we think highly of our candidate and think that they're compelling and have good stories and things like that. Sometimes you're just boring to camera. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes candidates get really fixated on having their spouse, speak to camera for them. And sometimes that works great. And sometimes voters don't like the spouse. Yep. And so, polling, and to some degree focus groups is a lot of it is message development. What are you trying to, what is the message that you're going to focus on? You have, especially a down ballot race, where you don't have the ability, like a presidential, of massive earned media. You have, the average voter might know one or two things about the candidates when they vote. And so developing the message, what should those one or two things be, is critical. But what gets less attention is the messenger part of it. What is how do you convey that message? Yep. Is it the candidate speaking for himself or herself? Is it a man on the street? Is it a third party validator? Is it one of these voiceover ads that often candidates don't like because they sort of feel like traditional political ads, but they can be more workhorse ads. You can get more stuff in them. And so, I think that's invaluable when we're able to do it, which again is not always the norm, but is to have these 7 or 8 people in a room watch our candidate speak to camera, or see 3 or 4 different iterations that maybe has the same message, but has different ways of conveying that message. And I think oftentimes you're talking about, in some of these cases, these are $1 million, several $100,000, $1 million decisions in terms of which ad is going to be on television. You can do this with direct mail and digital content as well. So to spend 15, 20 grand bouncing it off of some real live people before you write the big check, I think is very, very helpful. And numerous times we've shown ads before they go live to these focus group participants, and sometimes it's just something very small that is distracting, or people don't understand, that we think is, in our mind, is clear, but there's something in there that confuses them, or an image. I remember doing some races against some ads against Trump in 2016. The goal was to find, we were very excited because we had some footage of Fox News personalities, talking poorly about Trump. And the idea was, okay, well, that was something that Republicans will give some credence to. If you have Fox News personalities beating up Trump, that's at least a better way to get into it than to have Rachel Maddow criticizing Trump, right? That at least gets people's attention. And one of we had a flurry of Fox News personalities, mostly from the primaries or what have you, criticizing Trump for one thing or another. One of those personalities was Megyn Kelly. And in our thought at the time was, okay, well, she's, famous Trump person, but by then she had already gotten into a big tiff with Trump, and she had, faced down with Trump at a debate or something, and people sort of saw that, oh no, she doesn't count. That's Megyn Kelly. She's not. People sort of called bullshit on it, and so that was something we could snip out the Megyn Kelly clip and use the Fox News personalities that were that were more cohesive and more in line with what we were trying to do. So 99 times out of 100, we've gotten a lot of good, specific, tangible value out of these focus groups. And again, the media consultants don't always like it, for sure. But oftentimes, there's very specific, tangible, benefit from those types of sort of ad hoc ad tests.
Dave, what did I tell you during the Senate race here? That ad, when they put Ossoff's wife in the ad, and I had no idea she was a doctor. And it was like a turning point for him, for me. Like, I was like, oh, well, this guy's wife is a doctor. Like, it made him look better. And I was like, why did they wait, especially during a public health crisis? Why did they wait this long to put her in an ad? She was great. She looks great. She spoke well in front of the camera. And it was, for whatever reason, I thought it was a turning point for Ossoff, and he got better in his ads from there, even though I'm not sure I only maybe saw her in one other ad. But something about that, I think, made him more confident? I'm not sure.
It's well, I mean, but it is interesting in that, like, one of the things about this business is just kind of like, it's a shitload of money, but there's like a lot of it is real, what I would term like loosey goosey, right? In that his wife probably didn't want to be in a damn ad and told him, well, you can go run for your little Senate thing, but like, keep me out of it. I got to go be a doctor. Or she didn't like the way that she looked on TV, or she wanted to wait until she got, you know, some dermabrasion, or they knew that it was the right time to unleash it. But it's just funny to me because the first thing that I go to, because like, let's fight the last war, right, is like spouse dynamics. And spouse dynamics are fucking always, not always, but they can be very difficult, especially if like there is any, like friction between them, whether it's spoken or unspoken, in that like one of them is suddenly becoming more famous or more successful. It's a very, very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones I always think of, and this is one of the earlier ones, this was from the 2010 cycle, but it was a U.S. Senate race where the team around our candidate, he had been an elected official. You know, the team had been around him for years and years. It was a family, almost like a family around him. Everybody loved the candidate's wife. Was a sweet, very nice person, very impressive in her own right. And so when this guy was running for a higher office, the obvious idea for a lot of people is, okay, well, let's have his wife sort of introduce him. Let me tell you about the man I know. And so they filmed that ad, and we showed it in a focus group, and she was, 60 something, Southern woman, again, very genteel, but was very thin. And so people, we asked people, what did you think about this ad? People, and like multiple people, jotted down, she's a skeleton. She looks like Skeletor and things like that, extremely, unfair, nasty stuff. But, if you have your one chance to make your first introductory ad, it's at a minimum distracting. It was distracting to these voters to have her, or at least how she was presented in that ad, do it. So, we scrapped that and did a different execution of the same message. And I do think that is, candidates are notorious about, and some media consultants are like this as well. Before the start of a campaign or on day one of a campaign, before there's been any polling, before there's been any discussions internally with the team, before there's been any focus groups, sometimes the candidate or the media consultant has already visioned out exactly what all the ads are going to be. And that I think is really the role that pollsters play, that a campaign's team, but especially a pollster, should play in terms of being the watchdog on the message. Again, that doesn't mean I'm looking to write my own scripts. It doesn't mean I'm looking to have veto power over everything. But, there is this sort of right brain, left brain, where media consultants are often these, prima donna artistes, to use the most extreme example. But that can happen. And that's, that type of creativity is what you want in a campaign, but it needs to be tempered by the data and tempered by what is actually right for the campaign, and not just, a creative vision that somebody had 6 months ago.
Yeah, the ones that seem to get it right to me are the ones that understand. Like our old buddy Dave Brown always told me, if you just make voters like you, then like you can solve a lot of the other problems. And so a lot of it is like, okay, but you can make them like you with the vibe, but then you can also make them like you by highlighting these 2 or 3 issues that are really important,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the media folks I talk to now, I think a lot of the current thinking is that campaigns have just gotten too negative, and that campaigns need to do more positive. I've talked to multiple media consultants in the last few months who have, I think, separately reached some of those conclusions. And there's always negative attacks in campaigns. That's not going away. But maybe the balance, the ratio, the proportionality being more positive than it has been lately, because that's and especially from the campaign side, because there's all these other entities in a lot of races who are better prepared to attack with outside money and things like that. But as far as campaigns go themselves, are really the only actor who's looking to make your candidate more popular and well liked. So I do think that that's creeping into vogue a little bit more, is to maybe have a bit more, put a bit more finger on the scale for more positive ads versus going negative so sooner.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. So let's, as we've done before, So you're at 2006, you're at the Alabama Democratic Party, and we talked a lot about polling. How did you get into the polling industry and sort of to where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate that then the firm was called Anzalone List Research. It's now called ALG Research, which is based in Montgomery. At that point, was only based in Montgomery. I met up with John Anzalone and a little bit later Jeff List in 2007. Which is a polling firm based in Montgomery, Alabama. And I'm not even sure I realized it at the time. But the firm has grown since then. But even at that point, that firm was doing U.S. Senate races and congressional races across the country. But that is very unusual, sort of very accidental that firm was based in Montgomery, Alabama. There's not political firms, polling or otherwise, who have these national footprints based in every state capital or based in every major city. It was the exception rather than the rule, and I'm not even sure I realized that initially. But I was familiar with the firm and was looking. I think some of it was, I still had a job at the Alabama Democratic Party, but certainly saw the writing on the wall that we probably it was not going to get any better for our side, to look for some different options. And I just looked at their website one day, ALG Anzalone List Research, and they had some position open, and I don't even remember what it was, but I applied for it and ended up meeting with John Anzalone's wife, Wendy, who has an HR background, and she has not done this pretty soon after that. She was not had other things going on, but for a while in the firm, she actually did some of the firm's HR work, and I met with her and had a good conversation with her, and I do think I had some similar DNA that she picked up from me that she had seen in John Anzalone. Now, John is much more of a type A personality than I am. I'm a poor man's John Anzalone at best. But in terms of John Anzalone is a guy who, again, he had a parlor trick of winning free beer by naming in college by naming all 100 senators, right. And he has still to this day has old Almanac of American Politics on his bookshelves. And so I think she sort of saw some of the same, some of that in me that she obviously had picked up from him. And whatever the position I applied for, they didn't think, they didn't want me to do something and sort of end up being sort of bored or square peg round hole. So just sort of created this sort of utility player position for me that really didn't exist, because they thought, well, here in Montgomery, Alabama, and this is still how our firm operates, especially as it relates to the Montgomery, Alabama office. If you think somebody, who has some potential walks in the door in terms of being in Democratic politics in Montgomery, Alabama, you give them a hearing, and maybe you're a bit more open to them. And so that was in mid 2007. Didn't really even have a specific job title, but just sort of learned the polling business for several months and plugged in to where they took a bit of a flyer on me, I think, in a lot of ways. And in some cases was, being a number 2 on projects, a second chair, a third chair, but really apprenticed, learned the polling business for that cycle, for that 2008 cycle. And then pretty soon after that, that was a small firm at that point. And now our firm probably has 30 people, give or take, and 4 or 5 offices across the country. At that point, we had 7 or 8 people, and they were all in Montgomery, Alabama. And myself and one other guy were client facing, in addition to the 2 partners, John Anzalone and Jeff List. And so within 6 months, a year, I was not necessarily carving out my own book of business, but had picked up enough that I was able to engage with clients and was able to show an aptitude for it. And then 2008 was not just because of my presence there, but was a big turning point for the firm. The firm had done U.S. Senate races, congressional races at that point, but 2008, our firm was added to the Obama campaign's roster of pollsters in the 2008 general election, not the primary, but once the Hillary Barack Obama primary settled out, the Obama campaign brought in not just pollsters but several other media firms and others, and we were part of that around that same time, and I was involved in both of these, as second chairs. Their Democrats had won 2 races in the Deep South for Congress that had not been Democratic for a generation. One in North Mississippi, Travis Childers. One in suburban Baton Rouge, Don Casu. And those were, special election wins. And just coincidentally, were both, I think, in May of 2008. That were shockwaves in Washington because Democrats weren't supposed to win those races. I think it sort of foreshadowed the strong Democratic performances in 2008. And those races, those congressional races, I think actually gave, as I understand it, like Axelrod and some of the people in the Obama sphere the ability to bring us in. They were inclined to bring our firm in anyway, but we were a little smaller than some of the other firms they brought in. But because we had this profile, because we had just been part of these two big wins that shook up Washington, that got a lot of attention, that gave them the ability and the justification to add us into some of these heavy hitters. And so by the end of that 2008 cycle, I was at times doing my own work. At the end of that 2008 cycle, at times I was finding my own work to do, or I was being a very aggressive second chair on things. And by the end of that 2008 cycle, at the start of that 2008 cycle, we were one of a dozen firms, who were bouncing around. And then by the end of the 2008 cycle, we were one of 3 or 4 who had just helped elect a Democratic president. So that was probably the biggest inflection point to this date in the firm's livelihood, in the firm's trajectory. And I happened to be, right around the time I was
not a coincidence,
getting there was.
It's not a coincidence.
I was fortunate that, again, I was very fortunate that it was, I got in sort of early in the firm, before it had really blown up. And at a time where I was, anything the firm was doing, I was pretty much involved in at some level, which is not the way that it works now because we're just so much bigger. So that was, it couldn't have been, and I'll say this, I do think this is different, and this is the only political consulting firm I've worked for, but I think this is unique from what I know, talk to others, is that, John Anzalone, his ethos has always been to, hire good people and, push them forward and try to help them succeed. I talked to other people in polling, other, not just Democrats, but other people in this industry, and people at the partner level or the founder level can bristle if somebody, if they bring in somebody who is getting kudos from a client or is being is moving up a little too quickly. And the ethos of our firm has always been, we want sort of more people doing stuff. We want people rising up the ladder. We don't want to stifle anybody's growth. And for whatever reason, I do think that's unique in this industry.
Yeah, you talked about Casu and Childers, and Bright doesn't come online if not for those. We literally picked up like half the consulting team on most of those, and a lot of that was John, A, knowing it, and B, making sure that those folks were brought in and that those folks were able to, to work with me. And frankly, John directly protecting me from other people who were super aggressive or didn't think that we knew what we were doing, and was basically gave me the tools to prove them wrong. I think when you talk about your, the hiring strategy or whatever, I call that the Dennis Green strategy because if you remember I think it was 97 or 98, Randy Moss was on the board and he fell to number 17, and they had Jake Reed and they had, Chris Carter. They didn't need another receiver. They had a high powered offense, but he was this is the best player on the board. And John has been very smart about that and kind of seeing where you guys have been smart about seeing where the industry is going to go and sort of moving there as well. And it's interesting you were saying that you kind of were a utility player and then quickly were doing your own thing because, very quickly after doing Bright, John and I did Todd Strange, which you were pretty involved in. But then when you go to 2010 and I started my firm, you and I did Richard Lindsay, Leslie Vance, Billy Beasley, where it was you. Anzalone Listgrove was on the top of the thing, but you were the pollster, and we're saying, Dave, these are the things that you need to look at. You said something earlier funny about the road thing. I remember Leslie Vance, he was convinced that he'd gotten this interchange built or something. And it was 9% of voters cared about it, but the pay raise, he turned down the pay raise, and we fucking put 2,000 points on Columbus TV, and he won when half of his colleagues lost.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I talked to a media consultant recently who was very involved right before the 94 Republican wave, worked for a lot of Democratic incumbents before the 94 Republican wave, and tells a story. And, I guess this is maybe bad podcast etiquette to sort of tell somebody else's better story. But tells a story where, he was working for a Democratic member who'd been there for years and, had, brought in like a telecommunications hub to his district and done all these things and been really, really delivered for his district. And this was in 93, 94 when the House banking scandal was breaking, where these incumbents, most of them Democrats, were somehow able to rig the system where they could go bounce checks.
Dan Rostenkowski, man.
Yeah, they could go bounce checks, and it was cool. And so this guy had been in Congress for a decade, and they get test all these accomplishments in the poll, and all that anybody cared about was he had not bounced any checks. And so it is a reality there to it. But yeah, we had a really good run there for a while. I mean, you and I, Dave. In none of those races you mentioned, Billy Beasley, who started off as an underdog, I would suggest, in a state Senate race, it was a race decided in a primary, but Richard Lindsay, Leslie Vance, Richard Lindsay specifically, in 2014 was reelected. Mostly what we're talking about is 2010, but in 2014, Richard Lindsay reelected in what literally might be the most favorable Trump district, not just in the state, but like in the country. I mean, this is a district where Trump, 2 years after Lindsay was reelected, a Democrat was reelected in a district that's 98% white, and in very rural, very ag. Trump, got into the 80s there. And so,
it's in that Adderholt district, which I think is the most Republican district in the country.
Yeah. So absolutely. This is rural as it can be in North Alabama,
I forget what we were talking about, but it was like near the end of the election in 2020, and somehow like you'd ask me a question, so then we just, sometimes when you don't talk to somebody for a while and then you start talking, so then we just started texting more regularly, and somehow it came up, and you were like, "How the fuck did we win Richard Lindsay? Like, how?"
It's not supposed to happen, but we see that those don't happen anymore. Right. I mean, that was the last gasp. And again, not to be sort of too nostalgic, but I mean, I do, and I've talked to Republicans about this as well. I mean, it used to be, that a good candidate who ran a good campaign, you got a break or two, and you could win, you could win just as often as you'd lose. Yep. And now so much is about, sort of two factors. Most importantly, of course, just the fundamental partisan DNA of the district, but also just the timing. I mean, if you're running, if John Ossoff runs the same race that he runs in a bad cycle for Democrats, then he loses. If he runs versus running in 2020 runoff, which you had some good dynamics for Democrats. And so, it takes a little bit of the fun out of it, takes a little bit of the strategy out of it. If you're just having to sort of hope you're going to get a good wave and you're not going to be running uphill, which, a lot of ways you don't know until sometimes election day or close to election day, but you're running a campaign for 18 months and just sort of fingers crossed, hoping this is an election where Democrats don't lose all the close races, right? Which that can happen. But yeah, I mean, those races that you and I did in 2010, 2014, I still think, we're not sort of the highest profile, sexiest races, but are some of the more impressive strategic victories that I'm aware of in the last several years. It
was definitely a going against the grain thing and like marshaling the right resources and maybe on a couple of them inverting what even we thought the message would be, which is kind of pretty interesting. And it was just funny because like we've done a couple of these things where like at no point in my mind were we ever going to lose, but then when you look at the empirical numbers, like, you have to figure there's like a better than 50-50 chance that just anybody putting their name on the ballot beats that person. Richard specifically.
Plenty of quality Democratic incumbents, lost, right. In that era. People who seemed like they had a grip on their district, who had raised a ton of money, who ran good campaigns. I mean, there's some others who sort of sleepwalked and got beat, but some others who knew what they were doing. Absolutely got beat. And I do think the Billy Beasley race is interesting as well. What we're talking about with Richard Lindsay is overcoming the basic partisanship of a district, in a district that is incredibly Republican, incredibly Trump friendly. But in the Billy Beasley district, this is a district that was, is drawn to elect an African American.
It's 55%, or at the time it was 55% by general performance African American.
Yeah.
So in the primary, it was like 80?
A Democratic primary, it's 60s, 70s. And he had multiple credible, strong, black Democratic challengers, and our guy won pretty handily.
Almost won without a runoff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then
really
like
dominated
60-40.
those races. So again, one of those that you don't know really until election day. Are you going to pull it off like you think?
Right.
Because there's sort of all these factors. Just as in a district where you know that it's the DNA is so Republican, do all the Republicans just break against you at the end? Or in this district, in this situation with Billy Beasley, the sort of black voters just come home to a black candidate. Yeah. But in reality, he held on to a lot of black voters, and and certainly his relationship with black voters in the district is a big part of it. But certainly the campaign that we helped him run helped make that happen.
Doing $350,000 a media in 3 markets didn't hurt either, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it did feel like we were the candidate, running, sort of a professional operation. Some of these others were running more, a little.
I like to bring in the £1 million shit hammer,
Yeah.
That straight ticket voting in Alabama really fucks it up for the, if you've got a good candidate that's an incumbent that, has a good relationship with their district, like you can do everything right. And then all a voter has to do is walk into the booth, and they don't even look at your candidate's name and remember that they like him despite his party. Yeah. They just check the straight ticket ballot box and walk out of the booth, and you never even get to get on the field with that voter.
Yeah, I mean it's
they've taken themselves out of the game.
It's absolutely depressing, and every now and then, I will, somebody will invite me to come speak to some Democratic group or some other entity in Alabama. And I sort of have to tell them I don't really have any sort of rah speech. I'm happy to tell you sort of what I think about things, but I don't really have any magic elixir. I don't know that any of the people that are in that room are going to leave any more optimistic about Democratic chances, because I'm sort of in the reality business as opposed to the rah business. But yeah, the Doug Jones race was a good example of that. And I actually did a lot of work through the Democratic Senate Committee in 2017 when he ran, and our firm did that, and I was deeply involved in that. That was my first and most intense experience of the Chuck Schumer treatment, because he was very, very engaged there, and you would have sort of multiple calls with him. I mean, the good thing with that one, it was sort of always house money, in a seat like that. It was, nobody really expected it to happen until you pulled it off in December of 2017. But yeah, I mean, in 2020, you sort of saw it coming. I think Senator Jones, his time in office, he did about as well as he could have. He, delivered on what he said he was going to do. He was the type of senator he said he was going to be, and raised a lot of money. I think ran a fine campaign, and then at the end of the day, it just wasn't able to even get within spitting distance against a candidate, Tuberville, who is not Roy Moore bad, but Tuberville had plenty of his own baggage, and I would consider Tuberville, relatively weak candidate, all things considered. But it at the end of the day, it didn't matter as much, because the DNA, the core partisanship of the district, the partisan gravity was just so much that it really didn't matter. And it's sort of a bummer to see a state, Alabama is a good example. There's some others of these in the Deep South, where there's just no elasticity, to use a sort of fancy pollster word, where Biden got pretty much the same as Jones did, and that's probably what the Democratic candidate for governor is going to get in 2022. Most Democrats, barring a bizarre occurrence like what happened in 2017, are going to get in the high 30s, low 40s. A good candidate will get that, and a bad Democratic candidate might get that, versus some of these other states. Montana's notoriously, can have big swings and a lot of ticket splitting. But, even in places where they have more of a history of ticket splitting, it is over the last, in 16 and 20, 2016 and 2020, those presidential cycles, only one senator was elected in a state at the same time where the other party's candidate carried the state. And so that's 60 some odd Senate races. Only one did the state vote for a different presidential party and Senate party. And that was Susan Collins in Maine in 2020. Wow. And that's just a fundamentally different politics than used to exist.
And that everyone in the business grew up dealing with. That's the other thing. You have people that Joe was on our show, Chris Matola was on our show, and those guys came up and Chris talks about running a campaign, like the first pro gay rights campaign in Oregon for a Republican. and winning and beating a Democratic congressman. And so, in 2002, and now there's just, there's just not. And so it is interesting to me that in a lot of ways, a lot of the people in our business have been like, a lot of people at the top too, have been on both sides, have been prepared for a way of campaigning or a way of winning, certain, cross party campaigns, or cross affinity campaigns that doesn't really exist anymore. And so it could fundamentally change the way we target things. It could fundamentally change the way that the business is done.
I wonder though about, and this almost goes back to the conversation earlier about the difference between, say, North Carolina and Virginia. Like, how do the dynamics in states like Maryland and Massachusetts work? Where you have a Baker in Massachusetts reliably will elect Republican governors. And then, Larry Scott in Maryland as well, to any outsider, those are Democratic states.
Yeah. There is something a little different about governors' races, right? Louisiana has a Democratic governor. Mm-hmm. Kansas has a Democratic governor. It's something a little different about governors' races, which I think it's less so than it used to be. But it's something a little different about governors' races versus federal races, which polarize along federal issues, obviously taxes and cultural issues and judges and by design are the Senate races and House races have the specter of McConnell and Schumer and Pelosi over them in a way that governors can carve out their own profile, their own agenda. So I think to the degree there is ticket splitting still going on, that's where you see it. And there has been, as you say, Chris, this batch of Republican governors, mostly, on the East Coast, Maryland, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine until the last cycle, Massachusetts, of course, who have been able to withstand this partisan gravity. I think it's just gotten so easy. Some of this, I think, is just the way, cable news and online, social media. It's just gotten so easy to polarize people along partisan lines. So easy to demonize the other side. It used to be that, if you're a conservative Democrat or a moderate Republican, that people, some of the voters that were cross-pressured, maybe never really saw a lot of the negative against you. But now they're just spoon-fed all this negative for months and months and months, sometimes more than a year out. And so the longer these campaigns go, the more expensive these campaigns go, I think the more likely that sort of partisanship rules everything.
And in some of those states, those East Coast states, doesn't it seem like that, like they have maybe like a weird apparatus, or they have like a thing where the in party, the party in control being the Democratic Party, like their infighting in the primary can produce what's maybe like let's just face it, like can produce a bad nominee, and then the other guy is seen as like the sane kind of normal person that isn't way out on whatever, taxes or anything.
All of those Republican governors, at least their profiles are pretty moderate, common sense candidates, just like some of the Democratic, John Bel Edwards is pro-life, pro-gun, West Point grad, Laura Kelly in Kansas is, very, very middle of the road. I do think that, I do think as the Democratic base, increasingly so, are these suburban, college-educated, higher information voters. And I think just fundamentally those voters are more likely to ticket split than the voters that have increasingly become the Republican base, which are lower educational attainment and more ideological. I do think, some, college, professor, or, some white collar professional from suburban Boston is a little more likely to ticket split for Republican than a blue collar worker in Alabama is likely to ticket split for a Democrat. And I think some of that is probably going to be the case, just because of who the party's coalitions are. And it really wasn't that long ago. I mean, Dave, when you and I, in the 2000s, in the early phases of the Obama era, the Democratic coalition you certainly ran through voters of color, black voters in most states that we've talked about, but also to the degree they were white Democrats, they were often as likely to be older than younger.
Yep.
White seniors were actually a pretty good demographic for Democrats. These were FDR Democrats and Truman Democrats, and I do think that's and I've read data on both sides of it, but my instinct is that there is something to it where every day over the last decade, an FDR Democrat died and was replaced by a white voter, 18-year-old, white voter who's never known anything other than folks like them are Republican. And so,
yep.
That's, I do think as the party coalitions have changed, in a lot of ways, Democrats maybe are a little bit more likely to split tickets than the Republican coalition is. And I think that's probably something that helped Susan Collins in Maine to be one of the only senator in the last two presidential cycles who was able to win her seat at the same time the other party was carrying the presidential race.
So that's your trivia answer that'll win you those free pitchers of beer, right? Is the Susan Collins thing. You talked about at the beginning, we talked about all kind of being obsessive nerds. Like I can remember I can tell you how to get to anywhere in the United States, like just because I looked at maps all the time, and I know random, super random baseball player stats because we had the 1987 baseball encyclopedia and we drove across the country one time. And when I was bored, I didn't have a Game Boy or anything yet. And so I would just look at that. And so does your political nerddom from reading the almanacs and stuff, does that cross over into other things that you then become obsessed with, I don't know, wrestling or Mr. Belvedere?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had I think so. I think maybe just the way my mind works, my memory works, are certainly things that I don't have. I'm not able to call up instantaneously. But yeah, I mean, a lot of sports trivia. I think sort of like you, Dave. As a kid, we've talked about sort of wrestling in the old days, going back to some nostalgia here. And I grew up, I think, at the right time to be sort of a wrestling kid, because the first wrestling boom was in the late 80s, and this is Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant and things like that. And I was 6, 7, 8 years old, and that's who the product was geared to at that time, sort of the Hulk Hogan kids. And then when I was in high school, they had the second boom in the late 90s, when it was actually geared toward teenagers, and it was more, a little more risque and a little more adult and things like that. So I definitely
the attitude era.
So I remember going to, and we'll see. I mean, I guess people could dispute this, but going to Boys State, which people probably know what that program is, you supposedly take the and they have Girl State too. You take, I think this is after junior year of high school, and each school sends however many students, and they learn about government, and it's, I guess, ideally supposed to be sort of the cream of the crop,
the creme de la creme, homie.
Yeah, from each school. And I remember going in. This would have been in 97.
We didn't
98.
get invited to that, Chris.
I remember going, and there's a good movie, a documentary recently about what happened in Texas, Boys State here recently. It's a fun documentary. But I remember going in 97 and 98, and these are supposed to be the leaders of the future, and you campaign for governor and all these other things. And the two things I remember about that was the kid who became governor. All he did was go out there and shout wrestling catchphrases and, NWO Wolfpack and things like that. And again, this was supposedly I was not critical of it. I was probably target audience for it. And then the second thing I remember is, I think maybe the lieutenant governor, maybe the second best position behind governor, was a kid who, and he may be listening, so not to besmirch him, but was a kid who my recollection was got elected to whatever office he did because his last name was Craps. So that was sort of who you were dealing with, even with the best and the brightest, supposedly. So yeah, and I still will every now and then. I don't subscribe to the WWE Network or anything like that, but I will still occasionally go watch YouTube videos, and I find that sort of watching some of those are a good way to wind down at the end of the day, because it's sort of interesting enough. It sort of triggers this nostalgia that I sort of pay attention, but it's also not so interesting to me that I actually focus on it. And so it's a good thing for me to do it to wind down at the end of the day. But yeah, I mean, I went through sort of music phases like that, and sports, and sort of all these, for whatever reason, I'm on a kick now of, I got to it by podcast, but sort of going into like old Hollywood stuff. I mean, there's a podcast called the Johnny Carson Podcast, and it just brings on people who, were around the show and had some connection to it. And Gilbert Gottfried has a podcast where they will interview, sort of old Hollywood, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s Hollywood type. So I will go on these sort of jags every now and then. I do think I have a little bit of a compulsive personality that probably first showed itself for baseball, but right after that was politics.
You find yourself doing things like, I don't know, seeing a mention about Jimmy Hoffa in one book and then reading 3 or 4 books about Jimmy Hoffa in that week or two, like maybe some people on this podcast.
That is something I do have to force myself to do. And I go through stages where I read ravenously and then stages where I don't. So I'm not like one of these people. One of my pet peeves is you see people will ask, public figures, what books are you reading? And people will ask, they'll act like they're reading 2 or 3 books at one time. I've never read that. Always to me sounded phony. I've never read more than one book at a time. You read. That. So again, I don't know, but anyway, so again, I go through phases where I read a lot and phases where I'm doing other things, but I have to force myself to just sort of not read about the same things over and over. I have to force myself to read about things that I don't know as much as about, or else I'll just read about, FDR and Lyndon Johnson and politics and things like that, which again, not that I know everything there is to know about them, but it would behoove me, and I usually enjoy it when I force myself to read something that is a little off the beaten path, or else you just sort of read about the same, you see the same Sam Rayburn story that you've seen in 10 other books.
Like, I find myself like just sort of like I maybe would like get drawn to a jobber, like, big fan of the Mulkey brothers or something, right? Like I'll then read a book about like some random small time character, like that's tangential to the JFK assassination or something, just because, it's interesting. It doesn't add anything to your base of knowledge, except that maybe sometime you can answer another trivia question or something.
I do think there's something I don't have it fully fleshed out. I do think there's some connective tissue between politics and what draws people to politics and wrestling in terms of the good guys and the bad guys and exaggerated characters and some of the phony baloney stuff, people saying maybe what they really don't mean, sort of the kayfabe elements, the guys who are wrestling. The guys who are wrestling in front of the crowd and then that night are caught driving together and the good guys caught with the bad guys after
guzzling 24 beers.
Yeah.
With a bag of weed. Well, I mean, look at the guy we just had as president. I mean, we just brought this up on another show, but yeah, I mean, that's the WWF. I refuse to say WWE, but that's the WWF president right there. I mean, Vince McMahon is as much in the DNA of the, what made Trump successful as anything.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think, Trump, I think I think sort of the most interesting thing in the Trump era or after the Trump era is can any of these other, maybe it's not just Republicans, but can any of these other candidates sort of tap into what Trump was able to do? I mean, Trump was, the social media thing and sort of the tweets and sort of roasting people. And, you saw in the Republican primaries in 2016, Marco Rubio tried it every now and then, or Cruz would try it. And, you have all these poor man's Trumps. And, some people would say that like AOC on the left has some of that same sizzle and ability to cut through and talk directly to people through her social media account and her personal charisma and her story. But I think that is the real question because there's not much Trump's brand of ideology, I think, is relatively easy to be replicated. You see Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley and Rubio to some degree, trying to embrace some of this more populist conservatism. And I consider myself a progressive populist. So I don't really besmirch populism, but sort of the Trump style populism. But that's, I think, the easy part. The difficult part is this sort of connection with people that Trump had, and maybe it was because of was on the WWF. Maybe it's because he was this celebrity on The Apprentice. Maybe it's, I can't remember a time when Donald Trump wasn't, part of the pop culture lexicon. And if so, then maybe he is a unicorn that can't be replicated. But I certainly think we're going to continue to see people try.
I think we're close to. I mean, we're over time here, but don't you think that there is something though in this, like, you have 100% name ID or close to it, and you're not defined politically, that you see in Trump, that you see in Tuberville, that like it's very hard for a standard politician to grab that, like, to take that mantle and run with it. But if you're outside of the game and especially if you're seen as somebody who speaks the truth or whatever, like, I think that we're uniquely primed for a candidate like that because of the fact that every campaign since, especially since Reagan, but really since Carter, has run against Washington. And so then you get this person that's not just against Washington. He's like not of the ilk at all. I don't know any of these people. I don't deal with the donors, yada, yada, yada. And so there's just something there to me that, like, I'll give candidates some free advice. Joe Blow, state rep, you're not going to be the next Trump, but dude who owns a big company that is kind of like brash and loud, that's well known in your industry, that can translate that to being well known, being right on certain issues, you can probably make a lot of hay and be your state's governor or senator by coming out of nowhere and, putting $5 to $8 million of your own money into it.
Yeah, no, I think a couple of things there. I mean, again, 100% name ID. I mean, that is, people talk about the millions upon millions of dollars that Trump was gifted by the cable news networks, but due to the wall-to-wall coverage. But Trump walked into that race. Trump started that race with universal name ID, which is, again, worth tens of millions of dollars even before cable news became obsessed with him. But the other thing about Trump is Trump was not burdened, just like I talked about in a lot of these focus groups, a lot of voters are not burdened with having to have a clear-cut ideology. Right. Trump never felt burdened by having any ideology. And I think a lot of people on both sides, including the Democratic side, never really understood that Trump was running to the left of Democrats on trade, for example. Obama had used trade in 2008 against McCain and used trade against Romney in 2012. And that is a big part of why Obama was able to succeed in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt, even places like Western North Carolina. Trump was blistering the Bushes and the Bush's Iraq policy. Trump was a dove. Trump was saying he was blistering Paul Ryan's budget for cutting Social Security and Medicare. Now, Trump was certainly sending signals on some cultural issues, among other things, to pacify elements of the right, and he was talking about judges and things like that to make sure that the right was staying with him. But I mean, that's another thing that it's most candidates who run do feel obligated to be have some sort of consistent, coherent ideology. I think that's underrated in Trump's trajectory, that he was willing to say whatever he thought the most popular thing was at the time, in a way that most other candidates feel more obligated to have more consistency and don't have the ability to do that. And again, that's I think is one of the real question marks if how other candidates were able to try to replicate that.
If I read you right, what you're saying is embrace the heel turn.
Yeah. I mean, again, who would have thought? I mean, I remember thinking, especially when Trump was out there criticizing McCain, saying he didn't want to. He liked people who were not captured.
Even maniacs like me who love people getting ethered. Like, I literally live for it. What Trump ended the Bush dynasty by saying that Jeb was low energy. Right? Like, they'll never get elected again. And him saying that about McCain, I was like, whoa, you can't get away with that. And he got away with it.
There's a good book called American Carnage, which Tim
Carney, right?
Alberta wrote
Tim Alberta. There you go.
About sort of the Trumpification of the Republican Party in the last several years. And I think it's a quote from his book. There's this really right-wing Republican from Kentucky named Thomas Massey, who, anytime you see a vote that's like 434 to 1, Thomas Massey is sort of the one, just a sort of nutbag. But he, I think, had a moment of self-reflection where, his quote was, for a long time he thought people were supporting him because, he was, they supported his version of conservatism, or he was libertarian inflected because they really believed in what he did. And to paraphrase him, he realized after Trump that people were voting for him just because he was the craziest son of a bitch on the ballot. And it was, I think, a moment of clarity there. It's easy and tempting from the Democratic side to sort of poke Republicans and Republican voters for that. But I don't really know how we get out of that and not to end on a downbeat. But I do think it's a challenge for the country. It's a challenge for our political system, because I'm not of the type who think that things are just going to reset and go back to normal after Trump. I think that Trump has opened the Pandora's box, and and sort of we're stuck with it, and I don't know where we go from there.
Well, Zach, it's been a real pleasure having you on. Thanks for sticking around for some extra time. Zach McCrary is a partner at ALG Research. The podcast is Pro Politics with Zach McCrary, and that's available wherever podcasts are sold for free. You can also follow Zach on Twitter at Zach McCrary, and there's lots of, in addition to political stuff, there's also some interesting wrestling and nostalgia takes. So, Zach, we really appreciate it. Y'all
sure.
Come back.
Well, Chris, Dave, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun. I'm happy to have a reprisal here whenever you need to fill in at the last minute. So let's do it again soon.
Yeah, man. Thanks. This was fun.
Okay. Thanks, buddy.
Now More Than Ever is hosted by the chairman, David Mowry, and Christopher Crid Krauth, and produced by Rouge Mo Productions in conjunction with Send the Food Back Media. Chris Krauth is senior executive producer for Rouge Mo Productions, and Dave Mowry is executive producer on behalf of Dr. Divinity Recordings, Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes. You can also find us on Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pandora, Castro, and many other purveyors of fine podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at now_more_than_ever_pod, and on Twitter at nowmorethanev2. You can also follow Dave at the Chairman Mao on both Instagram and Twitter, and Chris at Chris Krauth on Instagram and Vesco Island on Twitter. Thanks for joining us, you filthy animals.